All right. So let's talk a little bit about the methodology that I use and most hackers use when we're going to go and try to attack your web applications. It all starts at the beginning with some recon. And what recon really represents is it's depending on what the engagement is, because sometimes it may be we just want to look at a single web application or host, but sometimes it may be you have a infrastructure, which may be on premise or in the cloud, and we might be looking for lots of different things through that. So one of the examples is we'll go and we'll look through your DNS records and we'll try to find the type of systems that you might have got exposed out there. And we can take a look at things like the CNAMEs to see what cloud services or other third-party services you might be leveraging that you're binding in with your naming conventions. We're going to take a look at these subdomains and see if maybe you have staging or development environments that we would be able to possibly go into, because they may not be as highly secured as your production environments, but have similar code bases. Because if we can get access to your code, it makes it much easier for us to find vulnerabilities in them. The other side of the recon too is it helps us to understand what services might be in use. There have been times where I've been taking a look at a host and I was able to find open ports that had no firewalling directly to databases that had default credentials. And that gave us direct access when it really shouldn't have. Or Redis caches that weren't properly protected. Or unpatched systems that they thought were behind a firewall but were pierced through for development purposes. And that ultimately gives us a foothold into the infrastructure. Then once we've done the recon and we know what we're going to look at a host, and then we're going to go through and do a ton more recon that relates directly to the app. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm actually going to show you. We're going to just go and work on a single web app, and we're going to do some recon that's going to range everything from taking a look at the host, taking a look at the web stack, taking a look at the application stack, and we're going to brute force a bunch of things. And hopefully by the end of it, if everything goes well, we will actually compromise the host. Which then gets us into that next thing we're talking about, which is we want to compromise that host. And what does that ultimately mean? Well, there's different ways of compromising a host. To me, it's not doing the simple reflective XSS kind of stuff on the browser. That's fun and it's sexy, but we're looking to get deeper in there, to be able to extract sensitive data. It's to possibly run code on the application. It's to get typically an ability to get a foothold on the system, which would allow us then to move on in the system to do other things. So as an example, one of the things we like to do after getting a foothold is finding a way to escalate privileges, because we want to be able to get the highest level privileges. So if you're running this on a Windows server, that's going to be an administrator account, but not really. We actually want system, because that's the highest level privileges you could get on there. But maybe this is an ASP.NET Core app that's running in containers that are running in Linux. So maybe that's a root account. That would then give us the ability to manipulate the container and break out of that container to get to the actual backing host, right? These type of attacks all require us to escalate and get past a certain amount of security that's probably in there when we first get in. Then we need to maintain presence, because, well, you know what? We could very easily be detected. We might get shut down. Maybe they'll reboot the infrastructure, and so any hold we have will get lost. So we're going to want to make sure we keep some presence in there, and we're going to show you some tools that we can use there. And then ultimately what we want to do is we want to move laterally. So once we get into the single host, what we want to be able to do is say, can we get to other hosts? Like, can we get to the database? Can we get to the backend clusters? Or can we get to management planes so that we can maybe move on to even more infrastructure to get even more access? And then, of course, we just go over and do it again and again and again. Now, of course, when we're saying to doing this, I'm talking about this from an ethical standpoint, right? This is me being hired to do a pen test and to find these resources, find this data, and help to safeguard and protect it by providing recommendations on how to repair it. Of course, the same thing can be used by black hats to do very similar things. They're just going to have a more nefarious attitude towards it. Okay, so that's it for my slides. I really don't want to have any more slides. But before we go any further, I just want to kind of set the stage of what I'm about to do. First off, we're going to demo a web application. I basically stripped it down to the essential vulnerabilities that I had found in a recent engagement that I did. So during COVID, like everyone else, I've been home and I've been having to do work remotely. And I was brought in an engagement on an application. I really can't talk about it. So We're redacted from explaining how the app works and everything that's on there because they're in the process, they fix a bunch of things and deploy it and whatnot. But it'll give you the concepts and the ideas, and that's what we wanted to do here. The other thing I want you to understand is that we're going to go through this in like less than an hour here. The reality is this took me, you know, almost a week to break into, and that's so I want you to understand that there's no hacker movie OS where you double click on something and you've penetrated a system. Like that doesn't typically happen. So a lot of this is a lot of grunt work that's done in at the command line, and what I'm going to show you today is we are going to take a look at a web application, and we're going to find some vulnerabilities in it that is going to ultimately give us access to completely control the server. Okay? So before I get started, does anyone have any questions, concerns, or complaints? Type it in the group chat. No? Awesome. All right. So let me zip on over. Manat, do you see a console window right now?
Yes, I do, Dana.
Perfect, thank you. All right, guys, so we're gonna start here. We're gonna assume here that in this engagement, I was told that there was some infrastructure that existed. And so I did some recon. I actually connected up, went through the DNS records, did some subdomain enumeration, found a box that looked interesting to me. And as part of that enumeration, what I was able to do is I have some automated tools that go and take screenshots of every single host, and I was able to find something that I thought was interesting that I could access. So what I want to do right now is I'm going to start the process of what I would do. I see a host, now I want to do something with it. What can we do with it? And that's going to be you know, the part I want to do right now. So to get started, we happen to know that this host is at an IP address. This is all on an internal LAN right now, so you know, don't worry about trying to hit it up. You're not going to be able to. So it's going to be at this 192.168.1.68. This could be any host on the internet or on a local network segment. We're going to just use that as our setup. And the first thing I want to do is I want to take a look at what's running on that host. So in my case, I'm just going to run something called Nmap that actually does a network scan of that host. And I'm just going to use attack SV, which says, take a look at the services that are running, and attack SC, which says, and run the Nmap built-in default scripts that actually will interrogate any ports that it finds. And I want to do that to the IP. And I'm just going to send that to a file. Let's call it nmap.txt. That way, if we have to come back and look at it, we have it. And this is going to run. This doesn't take too long. If you use Nmap normally this can be very exhaustive, but you'll see that we're doing what's called basically a quick scan. We're looking at for services. We're trying to understand what's there, and we're running the default scripts that'll do things like if we see web servers, it's going to do some host manipulation to try to see what's in the headers. And we can see here when it came back, we can see port 80 is open, and we can see that port 5357 is open. What obviously I'm interested in here is that I can see that this is running a server header of Microsoft IIS 10. That's useful. I know as a hacker that IIS 10 means it's running at least Windows Server 2016. So that tell me it's somewhat newer. So I'm not even going to try to do a lot of the hacks that are out there for older OSs. But it does give me some ideas. And this other port here, that's the HTTP API. Interesting. We'll have to maybe take a look there. The other thing, though, too, is that Nmap was able to give me basically an OS thumbprint to tell me that that's actually running on a Windows Server. Now, why that's important is because, as you know, it is possible these days to run ASP.NET code on Linux environments. And so knowing what OS will help me when we're looking at trying to figure out what we want to run, what we want to scan, et cetera, et cetera. So now that we know that, one of the things I want to do is say, okay, I see that there's a web server there. So I want to do a web vulnerability scan to see, are there any misconfigurations, anything there? And so I'm going to run a little tool called Nikto, if I can spell it right. And what I want to do there is I basically want to try to run through and see, are there any misconfigurations on the system, anything that's missing that I might be able to take advantage of? And this might be anything from, do they have weak certificates in the case if this was port 443, or do they have this misconfigured in a way, or maybe it's an older server. Very useful things, especially in Apache environments where on Linux boxes, they might have older versions of Apache that are vulnerable. And this tool will actually tell you if it sees anything that's interesting, it'll call it out. So we can see things as an example, like this particular server doesn't seem to have the XSS protection header not defined. So that might mean that there might be some cross-site scripting availability to me. I can also see, what kind of things are there. It's found this home directory, which is interesting. And they think, hey, maybe you should check that out. And what it's basically doing is it's connecting up, looking at the host headers it relates to the service. It's also taking a look at some simple or common directory enumeration. So it's basically doing some simple brute forcing, looking for certain things, with the whole purpose of trying to give us an idea of what's out there. And I can see here, not really a lot here. There's that home directory. We'll look at that. But quite frankly, I don't trust things like Nikto to do brute forcing, this kind of stuff. And I really want to fuzz the server and try to find all the different types of folder infrastructure that might be there. So I use a different tool for that, and that's something called GoBuster. And so what GoBuster gives me is the ability to say, I want to go and connect up, and I'm going to look through a word list that I have, and I happen to have this word list I built out that has almost 400,000 different directories that I know exist in typical applications. And so I'm going to just fire that off at the web server and try to see if we can find or detect certain folders. Now, when I do this in production, I actually have a set of ARM templates in Azure, and I spin up a cluster of these, and I break that up. I don't run all 400,000 on a single IP. I typically break it across usually around 5 different hosts. And the reason I do that is A, to prevent rate limiting, and B, to make it look like it's coming from multiple hosts so that they don't have a clear indication of what's going on. Because I'm always doing things with permission from the target, I'm very noisy. I don't try to be stealthy when I'm doing this kind of stuff, but I also want to make sure that I can get the job done in a reasonable time. So in my case here, I'm just going to run this here locally. I'm going to use a TAC-T40 that says to run 40 different threads. And I'm going to look for, I don't want to look for every single response because it might get tar pitted or stuck, but I am going to look for any directory that brings back a 200 or a 200 and 204. I also wanted to bring back 401 and 403s, which that'll tell us if there's any directories that are protected, probably with authentication requirements or different configurations that I might not be privy to because I'm unauthenticated. I've never even went to this service, so we want to do that. And then, of course, I need to know where I'm going to send it, so I'm going to send it over to my target, and I need a word list. So I'm going to use this one I have called Content Discovery All. And then I want to fire it off and write it out to a file so that I can keep it. And we can run this and you can see it going. Here we go. This will take anywhere between 5–10 minutes to run. I'm not going to sit here and wait for this. So while that's running, what I'm just going to do is show you a run that I did earlier. So you can see what the end results are going to be. So you can see here, it's found, obviously there's 200 in the main root of the system. It can find this home directory. There's a content directory there with a 403, some CSS, some favicon. We see a file directory here with a 401. We see fonts, more home directories, and some routes that are in there. That's kind of interesting. One of the other things as I'm looking through this, back into the Nikto, you can take a look here. You can see that not only does it tell me it was IIS 10, but it also showed me that it's running ASP.NET 4. And that's interesting to know because that tells me that that's probably an ASP.NET web application. We don't know to what degree. 4.0, so that's probably going to be an MVC application or Razor app, but we don't know that. It might be a web app. We don't, or a web form. We don't know yet, but we'll be able to explore that kind of stuff. We can also see there's an images directory and a scripts directory that might be interesting to take a look at, and an uploads directory. So this is what this scan will ultimately come back with in about 5–10 minutes. So knowing that, we can think about that. We've got probably some interesting stuff in content, file, scripts, and uploads. So that's good to know. So I'm going to cancel this scan because well, we don't need to sit here and wait for it. But we can see what the ultimate result was. Okay. So now that we kind of got some recon of what we're looking at. We have a server that's running a web server, running at least Windows Server 2016 with an ASP.NET application. We don't know anything about the app. Probably a good time to go take a look at it, right? So what I would normally do for that is I run a tool called Burp Suite, which is basically a man-in-the-middle proxy that gives me the ability to watch traffic as it's going across the wire. And even if this was a secured SSL-based web app, it will proxy that properly, and I'll be able to see inside that SSL tunnel so that I can look at the content, because it's actually intercepting everything at the browser. It actually creates its own self-signed cert that the browser trusts, and then it proxies that in to the actual SSL stream. So what I want to do here is for this target, since this is brand new, I haven't really set this session up at all, I'm going to basically add a host, because I don't want every traffic. I only want to look at the traffic that relates to this application. And you don't have to do this, but because things like Firefox are quite chatty on its telemetry data, I really don't want to be looking at that stuff. I just don't care. I only want to see traffic that relates to this application. So I'm just going to set that up as what's called my target scope. So that means that I'll be able to see anything that is related to that application. And then when I go to run this, you'll see that there's this proxy here. As you can kind of see, this proxy stopped it when I first started, and it looks like it was trying to go grab some Firefox release bundle stuff. But because I have an intercept on, it hasn't actually connected to it. So if I turn the intercept off, Firefox will go off and finish that. In my case here, as we're going through and taking a look at what's going on here, you can see all the traffic that was going through since I opened this. I obviously only want to show the in-scope data. And I want to see everything here. So, and there we go. So now when we go, we can see this filtering. We haven't actually connected to this app yet, but now I can. So if I was to go to this application, here we go. So now we can see that we have a web application in play. So obviously this is just a proof of concept demo site. There's not really a lot here, but in the actual target that I was actually doing live, it was actually quite similar. It was a service that was dedicated to exchanging patient data, and it didn't have a lot of services. So if you look here, there's really no links to anything other than a couple links here for some imagery. If we were to go look at the source code, doesn't seem like a lot of information here, right? We can just see that we have some images we're pulling from the images directory. And there's an endpoint here called file get file. That could be useful. We might want to know what that's about. And of course, we can see that it's loading up some jQuery and some Bootstrap. So, okay, what can we do with that? Is that something we can take advantage of? So if we wanted to kind of click on one of these images, we can see what's going on. Now over here on the left side, what you can see is every single request as it happens. So here's, as an example, was that request to this image. It was called doctor.png. What you see is the full URL. Now, if you know how HTTP works, then you understand how the protocol, it's a text protocol, right? And all you do is you send in some text and then it'll send back a result. So in this case here, you can see this sent back a image PNG, and there's the raw data that actually was sent back. And this is what's really cool about Burp, is that it can show you everything that's going on. So as an example, notice there's some extra headers here. As an example, there's an ASP.NET MVC version 5.2. Well, that tells me a lot right now. That tells me that this is an ASP.NET MVC app. And that tells me that model view controller. I can understand now what file get file means, right? As a developer who knows MVC, I know that that's a route, and that happens to be the ultimate controller and the function, right? We all know this. This is standard .NET stuff. So, but that's useful and helpful to me. So that tells me there's a file controller, and that's useful to me. I also know that this get file pulled back this image. What else can it do? And this is where we start getting into fuzzing the application, or the endpoint. Now, normally when you have an application, you're going to go through and click through everything. You want to go through every single link and ultimately create what's called a sitemap. And if we go back to the target, you can actually see there's this thing called a sitemap here that's going to show me every single thing I see. So even when I'm not paying attention, anything that comes across, it records that so we can have some of that. Now, of course, in this case, it's screaming at me and telling me, hey, I see this as unencrypted comms, but in a real app, it was actually over SSL. But you can see the idea of being able to keep this history of trackability of every single request and response so that we can understand how the application functions, especially if we want to manipulate it, which is something that we might want to do in the future. So with that in mind, I'm kind of curious about this get file. And so when I first saw this, I was like, well, what else can get file do? And so I would use a tool called Argin for that. And what Argin does is it is a fuzzer that actually will do parameter fuzzing on endpoints. So this is very useful for things like APIs, or in this case, MVC controllers, because we can try to find, are there other parameters for these endpoints that maybe aren't documented? So even if you have a web API that you have complete documentation to, it may very well be that there's hidden parameters or parameters to the platform that you don't know about that you might be able to take advantage of. So in my case here, I would just do something like, I do argin -u, the IP, and then it was what, file, get file. And I'd want to send it a word list that I have. Now it ends up, Argin actually provides a really good parameter list of the most common parameters that web applications use. In my case, what's really nice about this is that includes most ASP.NET applications that are on GitHub. So they actually have built a tool that will scrape all the different routes and parameters that are available for those routes so that they can trial those. And we want to go through. And this is a pretty intense way of doing it. But it's nice because you're literally able to test any possible parameters that may fit on there. And it'll come back and tell you what's there. Now, to make this work, I want to make sure that I'm going to send a successful request at the beginning. So I'm going to include what I already saw. So I already know there was a parameter called file. And we'll use doctor.png because that was one we saw that came across. And I only want to do the gets. Argin actually can work on posts too, but you got to think about that. That could be destructive if it's sending a bunch of post requests that might do things like, you know, create new resources, users, whatnot. But in our case, that was a get command, and then we can go and run this. So assuming I typed everything right, it'll go off now, and it's actually going to hammer on that site. And you can control this to make sure that you don't get rate limited and run through this. Now, I happen to know that this thing will take probably a good 10, 15 minutes to fully process and run, because it's going to run through hundreds and hundreds of permutations, and we don't really have a lot of time for that. But I can tell you, it's going to end up spitting out one more parameter, which is the content type parameter, which we will then use as part of our attack in a little while here. So I'm just going to exit out of that because no one wants to stare at a screen for 10, 15 minutes. But I want to make sure that you understand what I did there, which was I fuzzed out the parameters on an endpoint on IIS, and it would spit back parameters that were accepted by the host. And then that becomes beneficial because then we can see how could we leverage that or use that to our benefit. All right. So, okay, now that we've got an idea, we have this endpoint, it's interesting to us, called get file. We happen to see that how it functions, right? So if I go back to the proxy, we see this last one that happened here, there was a get command that was sent out and it brought back a result. Well, and I see this type of things where you have things like files, and I can see a command called file equals. I start seeing a scream out right there of, well, what kind of file is that? How are you reading that? Could we read other files in your application, right? And because we know it's a Windows server, this is interesting to us because maybe we can actually go and try to grab, oh, I don't know, files that don't exist in the web application, but we know exist on Windows. Like, how about the win.ini file in the Windows directory? Well, we could do that. Now, we don't know how far back. We use something called a path traversal attack, where we could basically just put ... to go back a directory. And because it's a file, we're going to want to escape it because the URL encoding and that we need to have 2 backslashes. But I'm going to go and say I'm going to go back 10 directories. Chances of us being that nested in the application is pretty rare, but it will at least give us an idea, because anything that, if it can only go 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it goes back that far, and then we go to the Windows directory, and then we grab win.ini. So what happens if we try to grab that? Okay, so that didn't quite work for us. It says the image, blah, 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 can't be displayed because it contains errors. The image. Okay, well, this isn't really an image. Remember, we found that parameter, right? That was content type. Could we send something like text.plain? And all of a sudden, we're now reading a file on the web server that was never intended. It's outside of IIS's visibility. And this is part of what's called the local file inclusion, and it's the ability of using path traversal to read things that maybe we shouldn't be able to read. So now that we know we can actually do this, what else could we read? Well, we're in an ASP.NET application. I'm just going to go quickly flip over to the chat window. Can anyone tell me about what, I don't know, application in an ASP.NET app that might be sensitive that we might want to grab? Config, yes. How about the web.config? Now, again, we don't know where we are in the path of this system, right? So in our case here, why don't we just start right off the get-go? Maybe this is all in the root directory, web.config. No joy. Okay, that didn't quite work. What about if we went back one more directory? Bingo. Now we've read the web.config, or maybe the app.config is another one someone's recommending. If there's an app.config here, we could read that too, right? Because now we're able to read whatever's on that host. And so I can take a look here. Now, if this, I can immediately look as I'm looking through the web.config, I can see that this is an MVC application. I can see what assemblies are being loaded here, right? And so I can see what version of Newtonsoft is there. So if there's vulnerable, trusted app, third-party libraries, I can know about it, right? And in this case here, I can see throughout this whole thing that we have an MVC application. If this would have been a web form application, what other data might be sitting here? Not sure? How about the machine code, the machine key that's used to encrypt the machine view state? What about your connection strings to the applications and your databases and whatnot? Because that's all originally was in the web.config. It wasn't in the app.config, right? So all of a sudden, we might be able to have access directly to the connection strings, which could be quite useful. Now, it ends up, because this is a modern MVC application, none of that's there. But what do we know about MVC applications and how they're built out? What other file is required to spin up these services? Can anyone think of another file that maybe we'd have access to? Well, if you don't know a lot about how web apps work in ASP.NET, especially with MVC, is you remember there's an application start and an application end, and there's an app data, and there's all these other things that get run. That's all configured through something called the global ASAX file. And what's cool about that, and here we can see here, is it's going to tell us of any special thing. Now, this demo app, I didn't do any special app start stuff. There's no special event configuration. But what is here, and what exists in every single one of them, is information that relates to what the app is inherited from. So in this case here, you can see this is inherited by vulnap.mvc application. Now, why is that important? Why is that useful to us? Well, that then tells me, based on how most people set up their applications in Visual Studio, that the solution or the namespace binary is called vulnap. And that is useful to me, because now what I can do is I can go and use things like Burp Suite, grab one of these things that we were able to get. I'm going to send it off to Repeater. what repeater allows me to do is manipulate existing calls, and I can do interesting things with it. So I could do this with the browser, but I could do this right in Burp Suite. So if I know that it's saying that it inherits from a class, an application called vulnap, there's a very good chance that in the bin directory where this is deployed, there will be a vulnap.dll, right? Now, I want to pull this back. I don't want to pull back text plain, because that DLL is actually a binary, right? So I'm going to tell the web server to send me this file as an application octet stream. And what we ultimately see here is that data brought back to DLL. Now, quite frankly, this is kind of an ugly way of getting this, because trying to then extract this out and put it in a DLL, not so easy. But we could use very simple Linux commands like wget to go and extract and download this file, which is exactly what I ended up doing on the production environment. I wanted to get access to their code, so I'm going to start by bringing down the binary. So all I did was I did a wget to the target. And I sent it to a file called vulnap.dll. And now I've got it downloaded. So what can I do with that DLL now? Well, it's code. So at the end of the day, one of the things that I want to be able to do is maybe decompile it into its root source code. So even though I'm in a Linux environment, there are tools that can do this kind of stuff. So if I was to make a directory called code, I can then use something like ilspy command, which will actually decompile the DLL, and I have the choice to send it out as intermediate language or to the IL or directly into code. So I just want to see the source code. So that's what I'm going to do here, and I will send that out to the code folder. And if I go into the code folder now, what I can see is that decompiled file. So let's take a look at the code. So I'm just going to use VS Code here for this. Now, this is really cool. If you don't know how, so for those who don't know, a little background here, I'm running a Linux distribution here called Kali, which is an operating system that a lot of pen testers use, but I'm running it under WSL, the Windows subsystem for Linux, which is basically a VM running on Windows 10 that's running Linux. But because of the way it's been compiled in to work with the Windows kernel, it has the ability to interact with my desktop. So I can run code here, and what it's ultimately going to do is it's going to run VS Code on my local desktop and then pipe it in across through the system as if it was a remote debug session. Or in my case here, I'm just opening up some code, which is kind of nice because it makes it easy to use some of these tools. I don't have to do everything in a command window if I don't want to. So you can see it's now connecting up to WSL, and now we can look at this code. And what do I get out of this? As it parses it, I get syntax highlighting, I get to see library dependencies, everything else that relates to the .NET code. Okay, so start scrolling down. Yep, we can definitely see that this is an MVC application. We can see it's running .NET Framework 4.7.2. That's pretty new. Every time I start seeing some of the stuff, it's like, ugh. Okay, so now I got some more work to do because it's probably not a .NET version that's not as patched. We're running this on a Windows Server 2016 at least, and we're running MVC. So it's a pretty modern stack right now, which makes it much harder because it means there's probably not as many vulnerabilities known. But what I can see as we start getting into it, any route configs, if there was any complex routing that was in there, I'd see all that. But remember when I was saying we could tell that it was MVC, we could know that there was a controller there? There we are. We can see there's the code for the file controller, and we can see there's an index. So remember when we did the recon, we saw there was a file folder, right? And that file folder had, I think it was a 401, which wouldn't allow us to get in there. And now we can see why. There is an actual basic security check that's in there, is allowed access. So we're gonna probably wanna find out what that does. Because we can see it's going to send back an unauthorized result if we're not authorized to see the root/file. We can see the get file, which we were working with just a minute ago, so we can see how that's functioning. So file/get file, that route. Remember when we had to go back a directory to see the web.config? Well, that's now we can see that this has been mapped to the images directory. So now we found during recon, we saw the images directory, we can see what that is. So there are images stored in the images folder that relate to this get file. So when we're calling that out, we now know that pathing is going there. So, okay, that's interesting to know. Then we scroll down and we can see a new endpoint, which we have not seen yet. Even during the directory brute forcing, the fuzzing, we didn't see a /file/upload file. And that's probably because the brute forcing didn't think about an upload file under a file controller. And because, as we can see here, it does require authentication, it's not going to allow us to get in there, so we don't see it. And then, of course, we can see here that it looks like what happens is it will take a post of a file, of a posted file base, and it writes it to the uploads folder. So that's interesting because that now tells me that other directory we saw during the directory brute forcing, which was uploads, that's where it's used. So we've now found pretty much everything. We found there was the home controller, which was the first web page that was fed to us. We saw when we were getting the doctor's image, that was the file controller for the get files. And now there's one here called upload files, which we haven't seen yet. And so we don't know how that works. So we're going to have to figure that out. And then, of course, what we can see here is this is allowed access function. So what we can see here, this is very weak security. It's basically just looking for a cookie. And it's looking for a cookie that says admin, and it's got to be set to true. So that makes sense. If you have an admin cookie, it's set to true. Now, in the real production environment, when I did this, it wasn't that simple. It was actually a JSON web token, but it was easily accessible, and I was able to do stuff with it. But let me show you what I did to get it injected. So ultimately, that cookie, how would we manipulate it? How would we work with it? How could we access it? Well, remember I was telling you that we were using burp, right? Well, burp gives us some very interesting powers to be able to do in-stream injection. So what that means here is that I'm going to go back to this proxy for a moment. And I'm going to go set the options. Actually, just before I do that, let me just do, we know there's this target called /file. And if we try going to it, we're getting a 401 unauthorized. Okay, but we know that if we have the right cookie for it, we could access it. Now, I could theoretically just go into the browser and set that cookie. Now, if it was set as an HTTP cookie, not so easy. But the other side of it is you never want to set a cookie directly, because if you're running with a more modern front-end client web application stack, like maybe Angular or React or Razor, and you're trying to work with some of these things, there may be some client-side code that relies on other things, and you want to be able to make sure that the server is shown to be sending back the data. And that's interesting to us. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to intercept not just the requests, but the responses too. And you'll see why that's interesting in a moment. So I'm going to go back to the intercept tab now, and I'm going to turn the intercept on, and I'm going to send another request. And so we can see the get. We can see that it's going through, and I'm going to forward that to the server. And here's the response. So you can see the server sending back a 401. But what if in the response, I simply set the cookie admin equals true? And then I forward that on. Now it's still going to fail, right? Because it got that 401, the client's going to properly handle that, and it's all there. I'm going to turn off the intercept because I don't need it anymore. But what happens if I just try going again now? And we bypass the authentication on that specific system. And we were able to manipulate what was being sent back from the server, and the client application just processed it. So certain apps, especially like Angular, where they take advantage of the streaming data in the model, and they're able to basically jam that JSON directly into the client app, especially if you're using something like RJXS or you're running some of the client local cache DBs, you can completely manipulate that client application and do some pretty nasty things. So when people are trying to do client-based security, you can pretty much bypass it any way you want to. And that's kind of fun. All right, so now we've been able to figure out found this new upload directory, this endpoint called file, which we know is already mapped to upload file. And we can upload a file here. Now, in the real world, what ended up happening was they were purposely filtering out certain things. So like I was trying to do some attacks where like, hey, can I upload a malicious web.config into this subdirectory? And all that was getting blocked. But the one thing they weren't thinking about is, what about uncompiled C# code? Can we spin that up or set that up? And it ends up that that actually does work. And I was able to upload some code that I could then execute on the server. And here's how it works. So I'll just kind of spin back over here for a second. And I'm just going to show you this literally was the code that I ran. Let me just. And here we go. So this is just some C# code that I'm going to have it run at the server. And all it actually is, if you look at it from the web perspective, is it's a text box with a button. And that button's bound to a go click event, which basically is going to call out to do a launch event. And this launch event is just C# code that loads a process. And in my case here, that process is going to execute command.exe to allow me to run some interesting things. Now it ends up that it's a little more complicated than that. I wanted to run something specifically that would allow me to get access into the server, to create what's called a reverse shell. And the way that I would do that is, it ends up that there are attack platforms out there, you might have heard of some like Metasploit, that give you the ability to run code and then have it call back to your own server and allow you then to manipulate the session. And that's a pretty good tooling to have, but these days, things like Meterpreter shells usually can get caught by the server antivirus and anti-malware defenses. But one of the trusted applications that run on pretty much all Windows servers is PowerShell. So that gives us some flexibility to do some interesting things. So I'm actually going to show you as an example how we can leverage and execute PowerShell on the system. So you'll notice here, there's a command here, PowerShell minus no P, STA, and then this special one minus enc. And the reason for that is we're going to actually send a base64 encoded payload that will then get decoded and run by PowerShell directly in IIS. And that's going to allow us to do some interesting things. But what that interesting thing is something in an attack platform called PowerShell Empire. And what PowerShell Empire allows us to do, very similar to Metasploit, it allows us to have an equivalency of a reverse shell, but with a slight difference. The key thing here is that this is actually a command and control server that runs commands based on instructions that are sent to it. It's not real time. So why this is nice is that it's very easy to park this and run this in a way so that it's a little more covert. In Metasploit, as an example, it's going to create a connection back to your host that you can easily see. There's a dedicated port always open, and you can see what's that's connecting through. And things like host-based intrusion detection systems and network IDS systems, they typically can see this kind of stuff. But Empire is a little different because Empire is, it goes and checks in over an encrypted stream over, in our case here, via HTTP, and looks for instructions. And then if it gets those instructions, it's going to run it. So Empire has some very cool things. I'm not here to teach you how to hack, but what I want you to understand is just how simple and easy this stuff is to build. There's these things called stagers, which is the code that you need to run that basically gets, in our case here, this web server to call back to us. And there's lots of different types of stagers. So you can see here some that are based for like Linux systems and OS X systems and Windows systems. And for Windows, you can have everything from malicious DLLs or C# applications to link macros or even just bat files like launcher.bat. And that's actually an interesting one because that was the one that I used. Is if I take a look here, I'll just show you what the code looks like. So what I'll do here is just zoom into this. You can see it. So what you can see here is this. You remember in the ASPX file that I wrote there, I had this PowerShell command, right? Here's what that command was doing. And then it executes this base64 encoded code. And I'm going to steal this right now because I'm going to need this in a minute. This is the actual malicious payload that is going to allow the web server to call back to my server somewhere else in the world. Okay, so just get out of there. And let me show you how it all works. So again, we have this ASPX file that all it does is it runs command.exe to call PowerShell, and PowerShell is going to be passed a parameter, which is going to be that base64 encoded malicious payload that's going to, hopefully, if we do everything right, call back to me at this machine. Now, what's interesting is this is a separate machine. This could be at some other data center. In our case here, we're on the same network, but it doesn't have to be. So let's browse. Let's take this file and we'll submit it. And if we look back over here at our history, we can see there was a successful post and it did some stuff, but what actually happened? Well, let's sit back over to our system over here. Nothing's happened yet because we haven't actually executed it. But how could we execute it? Well, remember in the source code, we saw that it just went and copied it over to the uploads directory. And the file was .aspx. And what happens when you run an ASPX file that doesn't have a DLL? Anyone know? It compiles it into a temp folder and then runs it. I'm not seeing anyone type in the chat. Can you guys still hear me? Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to execute this. It will compile, so it takes a few seconds because IIS has to actually spin out .NET, compile it up, and then eventually, if everything's gone well, it should actually show me a file. And there it is. So we take that malicious payload and we say launch it. And we come back to our Empire screen. And you'll notice here, it has received a stager and it's actually connected back. So I now have a reverse shell into that web server on my system. So just to make life a little easier for us, I'm just going to rename this so that we know what we're talking about here. So this is H3 mean 26, and we'll call that web. No, it doesn't look like that rename worked. So now we have this host connected back. This connection we're calling web for now. It's a machine called web server. We can see the username. It's connected right now as IIS app pool. And this is one of those IIS safeguards, right? It uses a limited principal that has limited access. So if we were to actually take a look, we're going to interact with this now. We're now going to send instructions to that agent running on the web server to be able to look at things. So as an example, I can do sysinfo, get some basic information. So you'll notice it doesn't happen instantly because it waits till the next time the agent checks back in. I have set this to be a fast connection. So it's going to try to check back every couple of seconds. But normally you might have this be a little more stealthy. Maybe it's every 5 minutes or whatnot, depending on your intention. In our case here, we're being loud and proud. We're okay if people see us doing this because we're trying to prove we were able to defeat the application, get into the server. But we are running as the default app pool, which really doesn't have a lot of privileges, right? So if we were to shell out to who am I and look at the /privs, what we can see is this application has very little privileges. But the one it has, which is exciting for us, is it has SE impersonate privilege. So if you know anything about how Windows tokens work, that gives you the ability to say this process has the power to impersonate other tokens, or basically it can elevate into other accounts if it's authorized to do so. Now there's lots of ways we can do that, but in our case here, we're going to have to run some malicious code that will allow us to privesc, or basically get higher privileges, because IIS doesn't have a lot of access on the system. So how do we do that? Well, first thing we're going to take a look at here is You'll notice up here one thing, and I had this problem. This actually ran me for several hours in the real one. So remember we saw IIS 10 was there. Well, that told me that it was Windows Server 2016. I was wrong. It was actually Windows Server 2019. It was a brand new infrastructure was out there, and IIS 10 is also the version number that's on 2019. So I didn't know that at the time. I ran for several hours trying to do priv-esc attacks against this, and it was failing because I don't know if you've heard, but there's these public priv-esc vulnerabilities, things called hot potato and juicy potato, which are basically these executables you can run that will do a man-in-the-middle attack on the Windows server to capture the NTLM hash of the system account. And Microsoft fixed that in Windows Server 2019. So I spent hours trying to break into this thing. And then when I was just happened to have been looking at the sysinfo, I was like, oh man, wrong OS. But because we know that right now, we can immediately go in and priv-esc this and get system privileges. So how do we do that? Well, first thing we want to do is we need to get some files up on the server so we can do some interesting things. It just so happens that IIS is an account authorized to write to, in our case, it was to the uploads folder, but we don't want to write there. And the reason for that is that typically IIS has other protections Windows Defender has on there for certain binaries and things from running in there. But because we're actually running as a shell outside of IIS, it's an IIS user, but we have this reverse shell, we can send and go to other places like users public, which everyone has access to. And we can take a look there, and we can see that there's two files there. I've already put them in there, but I could have very easily have just uploaded them using the command called upload, and I could literally do that. So actually, if I wanted to say del launcher.bat, oh, actually, I need the full path. So we can see that's gone. So I'm going to upload that back up so you guys can see. So I'm going to say upload home SolarStar web server. So remember I was telling you that PowerShell Empire has that stager. Well, the stager wrote out this file for me called launcher.bat, which is basically that PowerShell command that's running that base64 encoded malicious payload. And this is a bat file of that. And so I'm going to just upload that up to that endpoint. And now if we do dir, we can see it's there. There's another file here. And what this is so there's these public exploits out there called Hot Potato for Windows Server 2008, and there's Juicy Potato for everything up to Windows Server 2016. So I compiled my own here, which is called Sweet Potato, which is designed to work on Windows Server 2019. So this isn't a common attack, but it can work. And all this is it's a binary that creates a DCOM server that is allowed to connect via a pipe. And when it connects via that pipe, that connection is done with the token authority of system. So what happens is Sweet Potato is going to act as a man in the middle, and it's going to see the token as system, and it's going to extract it or take it out, and then it's going to use it. Because remember, we saw that IIS had the SE impersonate token privilege, which means it can use tokens, other tokens it has to elevate. And that's actually how normally when you want to change integrity levels, you go from being a normal desktop user to an administrator and whatnot. That's all done typically through these token exchanges. In our case here, we're going to run this command to then give us enough privilege to run command.exe as system. And then what it's going to do is run that launcher bat file, which will then create a new connection back to me, but as system, which will mean we'll have full privileges on. So if I type this right and get this right, and this is where you start to be very careful, because if you do this wrong, you can hose your connection. Luckily, this is a demo environment, and go to public, and we're going to launch Sweet Potato. And what I want to do is I want to say, what process do I want to execute once Sweet Potato runs? I'm going to say I want to run command.exe. But what I want it to do is I'm going to pass it a parameter of /c. and I want to give it that bat file. So if I typed it all right, you can now see that a new stager back is coming back in. And if we take a look, we can see this second connection is running a system. Now I'm going to rename that just to make our life a little easier. So now we have a connection running as web, and we have one that's running as system. So I'm going to interact with that one because that one has far more privileges. So if we, as an example, do another sysinfo, we can now see that we're running as system. More importantly, if I take a look at the user and look at what tokens they have, what you can see here is a lot more privileges. This is the highest level account on the system, and we're now in. So we have full privs as system account. So what can we do with this? This is where we can have a little bit of fun, because we ultimately want to be able to get more access. So remember back in the slide deck, I was talking about, we start with the recon. Well, we did that already, right? We went and looked, we did an Nmap scan, we did a NICTO scan to look at what kind of web server it was. We did some directory brute forcing, found a bunch of different paths. We found some endpoints, and we were able to leverage the endpoint to do a vulnerability in a path traversal attack. We used the path traversal to find the a global ASAX file that gave us the ability to know what was the binaries behind the scenes called vulnap. We were able to then download that binary and decompile it, get the source code. Okay, now we've basically got our foothold when we were able to upload that malicious ASPX file and run that payload. But now that we've got the foothold, we privest. Now we're running as the highest privilege, but now we want to stay, because right now, if this server got rebooted, I'd lose everything. So how would we do that? Well, first off, I'm running a system. System is the most powerful account, but it doesn't have interactive login privileges usually. So one of the first things we want to do is see if we can maybe get the passwords off the system that we want. And one of the ways that we can do this is we can use a module, and they have tab completion, which is pretty fun for this stuff. But you can see there's a whole bunch of different ways that we could collect credentials in the system. So in our case here, there's a tool that we have access to called Mimikatz. And what Mimikatz does is it actually will go and read into the LSAS, and it'll look at the credential store, and it'll try to extract any credentials that it can see there. And in our case here, we're going to go and say, just get us all the login passwords that exist on the system that Mimikatz can find. And this is all in memory, right? It's looking inside of the operating system because it's got system privileges. It has the ability to get into those memory segments and try to find this stuff out of the different processes. So we're going to run it. So we're going to execute. And this module is just going to take a couple seconds here, but it's actually going to connect to LSAS. It's going to connect to the credential store. It's going to connect to the registry and take a look at some of the DAPI stuff. And it's going to try to see if it can find any credentials for different processes, services, and login accounts. So it takes a little while to run. So we'll sit here and spin our thumbs here while we wait. While I'm doing that, let me just go back and check in the chat. Is this useful? Are you guys finding some interesting ways on how we can actually get access to a bunch of stuff on your server? Give me a thumbs up or a yes. Very interesting. Cool. All right. All right. So we can see the job started now. It checked in. Let's see what happens. Remember what I said at the beginning here, there's no hacker movie OS where you click a things. You actually have to do a lot at the command line here. But as we can see, we scroll through here, we can see tons of different services and host drivers and whatnot. And if we scroll up, what we will eventually see here, because I had already peed in here, here it is. There's a remote interactive connection as a user called administrator. And what do we see here? We can see their NTLM hash sitting right there and their SHA-1 hash. So that's useful to us because we could probably leverage that information. If this is on an older Windows server, the hashes don't even get seen. You actually see the clear text password. But in more modern operating systems, they clear out the clear text password out of memory, but they can't get rid of the NTLM hash because that's part of the session and that's needed. So in our case here, Empire will actually store that in a creds table for you. So if we look at creds, there is my NTLM password, and now that I have it, and by the way, this is all stored locally on my machine so that even if I get disconnected now, I have that information. So I'm gonna copy that hash, and I have some tools like rcrack that will actually go through. I have several terabytes of rainbow tables of different hashes, but let's assume I didn't for a second. I could go to websites like CrackStation, which are online tools that have tons of these hashes like NTLM already cracked for you. So if I go and put this in, gotta prove I'm not a robot here. And we'll crack the hashes. And there we go. We actually just cracked that NTLM, and the password is PSSW. Okay, I'm not going to show a real password, guys. Like, let's get real. But you can see how simple that was to now got the foothold. And because that's on the system, now the question, guys, well, wait a minute, isn't that salted? No, no, no. The way that NTLM hashes work is if the password's less than 16 characters, it'll fit in the first half of it. The salting won't work. So what ends up happening is to make this backwards compatible, these type of things, the hashes are reverse encrypted and, or sorry, reverse cracked. And what's really cool is things like CrackStation, or if you're like me and have terabytes of storage, I have NTLM hashes up to 15 characters. So I have every single NTLM hash up to 15. Most people don't have passwords larger than that. But when they do, there's other ways to get in. The other side of it too is we don't always have to have the clear text. I want the clear text password because now I have the administrator username and password, and I happen to know this machine has RDP access. I can now come back in later as an RDP session. I don't need to hack at it. I can get in as administrator. But that's probably not good enough. Because maybe they'll change a password. That could all be bad to me. I might want to go a little further. So the way that we would probably do that is we want to get persistence. Well, just like we have modules for collecting passwords and whatnot, we actually have the ability. They have some pretty cool features here for collections. Like we can actually go and get a dump of Chrome if Chrome was on that machine, or Firefox, or Chromium with New Edge. We actually have the ability to run keyloggers. So we would be able to inject a keylogger into the Win login process. So the next time someone went to log in, we would actually be able to collect that. Webcam recorder. So if you wanted to turn on the webcam remotely and see what they're doing, you can do that. You can get the full browser data. So if you want to get all of their history and everything that's on there. One of my favorite modules is the clipboard monitor. And the reason is that most administrators are getting smarter these days, and they're running LastPass or OneLogin, because these tools allow you to have a much more complicated password, and they'll automatically inject it, right? And what do they do? How do they do that? It's done through the clipboard. So you can actually turn on the clipboard monitor, and at any time the clipboard's used, it'll record whatever that was in the clipboard. So when that password gets in there for a very quick moment, while the browser extension injects it directly into the form, they do that through the clipboard, you capture it. Or if someone's like copying and pasting creds as they're trying to run them in a PowerShell window or accessing something else, you'll have every single one of those recordings, because once you've enabled it, it just runs. You don't even have to be there. It will then send back the information over time and store it in your local database for you. But I'm not here to do all that kind of stuff. Hey, you can even do screenshots and take a look at what's on their screen at the time that this stuff's going. But my case, what I want to do is, remember, we're going back to that whole hacking methodology. We want to get persistence. And the way that we do this is through the persistence modules. So you can see here, there's a bunch of different kinds. If I wouldn't have been able to get that privesc and I need to come back and I need to be concerned that maybe they're going to reboot the box, I could use the userland registry and schedule task commands. And what this does is this injects into the registry or into your scheduled tasks code that will then run it when you deem it appropriate. so that it will call back to you later. So as an example, typically when I'm doing a longer pen test, I'll set up a scheduled task called update, and it'll be masked in the Windows folder in a way to look like Windows Update, and it'll be scheduled to run once a day so that it can connect back up to the host, and I can then have it send instructions. I have a custom module I wrote that when it sees it come in, it informs me by text message, and then I can just go, okay, I know that's now connected. I can now go in and change it to be more responsive. Instead of once a day, be once every couple minutes, and now I can do the work I need to do on that host. Of course, because we're in an elevated context right now, I would use the elevated registry. And what that would then do is it would create a debug registry key that would sit in the environment in a way that would then, on a reboot, automatically restart Empire's agent and callback, so that way we could maintain presence on that system. So once we have the persistence in place, one last thing we want to do is we want to move laterally. We want to get off this box and we want to get to the next box. So typically there's not just a single host. There's probably going to be several hosts that are involved, probably some databases, some cache servers. Maybe if this is in the cloud, it's accessing a bunch of other cloud services. We want to be able to pivot and get out of there. Well, how do we find what's available? Well, this is where we start using things like the situational awareness modules, and we look for the network modules. And what that does is it gives us the power to do things like, if this will happen to have been domain joined, it would allow us to query the domain controller and find all the other hosts that are accessible in the forest. We can actually scan for shares and look for user accounts and find other computers, and then allow us to pivot, and then we start over. We go and recon that machine. We look to find what ports are available by using Nmap. We then look through and run scanners. If it happens to be a web server, we're going to run things like Nikto. If it's running SMB shares, we're going to run some tools to look at the different SMB shares that are available, or through WMI. And it's going to allow us then to use this web server as a pivot point to then move on to systems behind the system that aren't usually exposed to the internet. Okay, so that's it. That's the whole process of what happened. So if we take a look back, what happened here? We did some recon. We found a host. We scanned the host, found that it had a web server available. We did a vulnerability scan on the web server itself, found that it was running IIS 10 with ASP.NET. We were then able to take that information and we brute forced and looked at all the different directory paths that were available, and we did find a majority of them. So we found there was the uploads directory and the files directory, then there was a scripts directory. We found the endpoints, which was get file and upload file, which was, well, we didn't find an upload file right away, but we did find that there was a get file. When we went through the web itself and using Burp, we were able to see the interaction with the endpoint service. We ran Argin to do some parameter fuzzing to go and find what other parameters get file had. With that, that gave us enough information to then find a path traversal vulnerability, which was very simple. It just simply broke out of the file read code that was there and gave us access to look at other things. In our case here, we were able to look at the web.config, and then we found the global ASAX file. That allowed us, because we knew .NET automatically has these binaries that are sitting behind in the bin directory, and we knew what that naming convention was, which was vulnap, and we were able to then download that DLL. We then decompiled that DLL with IL command spy, and then we were able to look at the source code. We were able to find that upload file endpoint, and we were able to see the authentication. We were able to bypass the authentication by injecting the cookies in the stream as it got sent back. That gave us access to do the file upload. We were able to upload a malicious file that basically ran PowerShell, and then we used PowerShell Empire's payload to basically have the server call us back. When it called us back, it gave us access as IIS, which doesn't have a lot of privileges. But because Windows Server by default does have access to write to users public, we were able to stage up the Empire malicious payload, as well as the thing I built called a Sweet Potato that I compiled in there that then used an exploit that allowed us to get an NTLM hash of system, and then use the token impersonation that IIS had privileges to do to then elevate as system to then run the launcher, and that then gave us a shell back that we're now running as system. And then at the end, we had the power to steal the credentials out of memory, gave us the administrator password. We could have then set the persistence up, set up our registry callback, and now we have access to that server forever, or at least until it gets detected, which in most cases, you know, advanced threats out there like state actors are using Empire all the time. As a trusted process, PowerShell is one of those things that get past most antivirus and anti-malware, and being able to run that stuff and give us these commands gives us complete access to the box. We could, at this point, download any files we want, pivot off to other systems, and there we go. Any questions? Let me just take a look at the chat window here.
You'll have to scroll back. There's been a few.
I was there. All right, bear with me, guys. Was that useful?
Definitely, yes.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Relevant honeypots and log files. Well, yeah, so on IIS, by default, you'll find that normally IIS is configured to be in /inetpub. Inside inetpub is www root, which is where the main web applications are typically stored. And then there's logs, which is where all the log files are. There's also, though, you got to be careful, there's also an HTTP error file that's actually in the Windows directory. It's a little deeper down there. I can't remember exactly. Hold on a second. Let's see if I can just quickly go find it by looking at it here. Windows System 32. Is it log files? Yeah, log files. Yeah, so there's a Windows System 32 log files HTTP error, and that will have actual errors that get intercepted by the IIS process. So a lot of times when you're trying to hack at some of these things, when there's not coding defects, but maybe protections that Microsoft's put in place. So things like, especially on things like XSS and XXE, there's a bunch of techniques that Microsoft uses to try to suppress that and make that much harder. And when it intercepts that there's an ISAPI extension that's at the low level. It's right at the beginning of the pipeline for IIS. It will actually write those errors there. They don't want to write them to the general weblog. So as an attacker, that's nice to know, because then you can go and see if IIS itself is blocking that kind of stuff. Okay, so people are talking about, yeah, the configs, web config, app configs. Yeah, so you think about it, if an LFI is found, if a path traversal is there, you can pretty much read anything, depending on how it's scoped and how it's accessible. But as a developer, you should always be thinking, what kind of artifacts get left behind? And it's quite comical the amount of times I've seen web applications on Windows where they may have deployed originally in debug mode, and so they didn't have it in a release mode, and they didn't clean up everything. So there's all this cruft that gets left behind. This is where it's really useful to use things like Azure DevOps and properly build and compile, and then deploy in the pipeline a clean set of files so that you're not leaving behind a lot of cruft. But some things have to be there. So knowing that we knew it was MVC, we were able to know, hey, global.asax, that's always there. And it's an optional file, but it's by default automatically written there because your application start events all get registered in there. And so by default, the templates just write them out. Definitely scary. Okay, that's good to hear. Every time I sit through Dana presentation, it scares the crap out of me. Thanks, Mark. That's good. One of the practices I've come across suggests to use environment variables to pass creds. Well, that's actually not so great, because once we're running in a console window, we can just echo out the environment variables. They're sitting there, easily accessible. So we can extract that information. So it's kind of interesting, especially in environments like Azure, right? So it's common for people to say, and I've even presented this before to this user group, hey, don't store your key vault settings directly in your web.config. Instead, configure it in your application config as a key vault link, right? But what does that do? It stores your creds as an environment variable. So there at some point you need to recognize that the security risk you have to think about, what do they have access to, what can they do? If someone has the access to be able to read the environment, they pretty much probably have full enough access to do other things anyways, right? So if you want to get around that, what you need to start doing is doing different types of trusts, like certificate trusts, which you can use when connecting to things like Key Vault. So you can extract the things that you need by using two-way trust. You can create IPsec STS connections so that you'd have the ability to create secure, trusted connections between hosts, keep them on private networks. But you're really starting to get really tight in there, and you need to really work with your admin group to find what's reasonable, because you can't apply everything. At some point, you got to think about. In this scenario here, if I was to complain about how this application was, they were rushing to get this out because during COVID, they had built this new application stack and wanted to be able to get this patient data to the right people at the right time. They asked us to come in and take a look at it. And what we saw was the developers that were responsible for how to get the files from the imaging systems to the web server, they didn't understand about things like LFI. They didn't understand about this path traversal. So they thought, hey, it's a trusted application. I know that I can just say, get me this file, and it will get the file. No one thought about, well, what if we broke out of that and we were able to do that? But hackers do. This is common stuff for us, is that we look and say, how can we break this kind of stuff? So it all comes down to things I've been telling you for years. Never trust user input. Always validate it. Always verify it. You could easily have validated to make sure that that path was only in a path authorized in your application stack and not fetch the file if it's outside of that. But you need to know to do that. Not everyone does. And in that scenario, when we worked with the developer to talk through it, he said, I went to Stack Overflow. Here was the article. It seemed a reasonable approach. Everyone said this is the right way. And we love those kind of security holes, right? So the question's been asked, what about Linux environments? I think actually Linux environments are actually easier in a lot of ways. And I'll tell you why. Getting root access, there are tons of tools out there that make this available. ASP.NET Core applications running on Linux are typically done usually in a container, doesn't always have to be, and they run on something called Kestrel. Kestrel is not a hardened web server. It's not designed. You were supposed to have it in front of a proper web application firewall or something else. And so most people don't. And so what ends up happening is you expose yourself to the same kind of risks. Instead of using things like Sweet Potato on there, I would be using other types of attack vectors that would allow me to run and get the same equivalency of getting a back-end shell. And then I'd use what's called netcat. I would create a connection back to me. Then through that netcat connection, I would stabilize the shell, and then I would have the shell in there. I'd upload something called linpeas, which is a tool that will actually look for vulnerabilities on that host, tell me what I can do to then prevesc. Typically, you can usually get in because of poorly configured sudo commands, and that will then give us enough of access to gain access to that Linux host. So no OS is perfectly secure. It doesn't exist. And applications make it harder. What's really interesting these days is the people that are running it in the cloud who then run it and choose app plans that are shared. So now I'm not going to go and worry about attacking your host. I'll just find another target during my recon that's on the same physical hardware for the purposes of trying to breach it to then get in through some backdoor that's on there. And that's a lot more details, and there's a lot of tricks to make that stuff work, but it can be done. And so it's important to think about this. When you run code that people can access, if you provide them the ability to send information or data to it, and you can't trust it, and you don't verify it and validate it, game's over. Was the key problem the content type? No, actually, so interestingly enough, when I first ran through this, I didn't run Argent right away on that scenario. I first went through that, and I actually started using burp, and I started playing. I saw immediately that there was that file parameter, and I was like, oh, this might be interesting. So yeah, I was able to immediately see that I could get access to the file infrastructure. And then what happened is that through burp's actually pretty smart. It will decode, and so without passing a content type, I was able to actually get the text files. So things like WinINI, that stuff came back right away. Web.config, I found that. I could read that right away. But when I went to go get the DLL, that's when things blew up. And that was like, oh shoot, I wonder if there's some other way that I could get access to it. So then I parameter fuzzed the endpoint. I found the content type. I knew immediately that what content type meant. And so I used that to my benefit. And then, yeah, sure enough, it gave me the binaries. So there's a question here. It was like, you simplified some of the hurdles you encountered in the real app, but like the JOT token. So here's an example of how it worked with the JOT token. So it ends up that in my scenario, the JOT token was just, they used it as a cookie in a special way that was then passed into the authorization as a bearer token in the authorization header. So in Burp, all I did is I wrote a little script that basically every time, and this JOT, by the way, kept refreshing every few minutes. So it was very annoying because normally JOTs would last like at least 30 minutes. But these ones were actually more short-lived. But through Burp, I was able to use a script that every query I would do, I would go in from the cookie, and then I would regenerate the authorization header. I would be able to regenerate the token, and then that allowed me to, the cookie, and I would re-inject the cookie on every callback. And so I was able to trick the front end application to have a valid JOT in each turn. So now the question will be, well, wait a minute, how did they get through to see the upload there? Well, they had a JOT that was validated. They used the same one for an anonymous session as they did with an authenticated one. They just used it differently. They had two different JOTs, one access token for high priv, one for the base app. So I was able to use the base JOT to get access enough that allowed me to get the DLL that allowed me to see the code. And then once I saw how they were using the JOT for them to upload, to actually do the upload of the file, they had that stronger JOT. So because I had the code though, I was able to figure out how they were doing that. Oh, okay. So it was like every 2 minutes there was a new JOT. So I was just like, okay, cool. I will just make sure that I'm building a system to fetch a new token, because they were using an OAuth endpoint that allowed you to basically mint a new token whenever you wanted to make a new request for it. So I, instead of waiting on them to issue a new token every request, I went and got a new token. And so that allowed me to bypass it. So that kind of stuff, if you understand how the applications function, you can find ways of breaking it. What 3 pieces of advice can you give web developers to avoid this? Never trust user input, never trust user input, never trust user input. The reality is understand your tools and your technologies that you're using. As an example, the global.asax file doesn't have to be there if you don't have any events on there. Good deployments would actually strip that stuff, and you really should. When you're thinking about deploying your applications, work with your admins to think about least privilege, because in this scenario, this application was actually running as a standalone host, but it connected to a backend server. We were able to pivot onto that backend server that was connected to the domain, and that allowed us to then get full access to it. It was much messier than just this web app. So it's very important to try to use least privilege when possible, so that if you get back to that attitude of assume breach, okay, assume they did get in, what next? How does this affect you? How does this affect the application? What more can you do? Knowing that helps you to be able to get into these systems and figure out what's going on. Is there tools to show the encrypted data retrieved from SQL Server when always encrypted is activated? Yeah, so actually when you're making a query into SQL Server and you've turned on trusted connections, those trusted connections are coming back and across through the app and the host, right? Well, you can man in the middle in between those as well. You're obviously, unless you're directly querying the SQL Server in a client app, you're not going to see that through Burp proxy, because Burp's only doing a web-based proxy. But there's tons of different types of proxies that you would be able to inject. So as an example, we're talking about a web application. You could just as easily do this on a Windows application or onto a UWA app. They're all using messages, and there are things like Message Spy and whatnot that can be attached to look at this kind of stuff. And then there are actual proxy tools that allow you to intercept and inject and change those. So it doesn't have to be a web app. I like web apps because you can be almost anywhere. I mean, Starbucks and getting paid to find vulnerabilities in people's applications, and everything from government agencies and banks to application vendors running SaaS things. There's always work out there. These apply to web apps hosted in Azure. Yeah, these type of attacks, it's irregardless to what the platforms are. They may act differently. As an example, if you're deploying a web app using containers in Azure, you're obviously using a containerized instance, right? You're either going to be using ACI or you're going to be using a web app for containers. But containers are not a security safeguard in themselves, right? Like I don't have time to really go into it today, but I've done presentations before on how to break out of a ASP.NET based container. Because if you have the ability to understand the binaries that are running on there, you can exploit that with binary exploitation that will give you access to the underlying host. And then you break out of the container, now you're in the main host, now you can use Docker and get into other people's containers. And these are things you need to think about that's through there. That's why it's important as an example. When you're choosing an app service plan, you want a dedicated plan for dedicated hardware so that you are not sharing it with other hosts. So that if they're breached, you're not breached. Yes, it means it costs more money, but it's no different than would you share with all the developers for all their applications on a single IIS server in-house? Probably not. You're going to separate it and maintain it. And that's just good IT hygiene, right? Same thing exists here. And by the way, this isn't just Azure. You can run .NET apps in AWS the same way. You can have the same type of vulnerabilities that are there, depending on what's there. At the end of the day, something's got to service your code. Whatever that web server is, whatever that application is, there will be something backing it. Now, I shouldn't say that. It is possible, I guess, to run a single page application that's running off of just a storage account and running all locally. But guess what? We can attack those applications just as easily. You could find something like some vulnerabilities in the application that would allow you to taint the cache, in which case you could inject your own JavaScript and run that on the client. Again, do the same thing. Get yourself a callback. There's tools like Deadbeef that allow you to basically completely control a person's browser. So you can inject on the server some XSS that would basically reflect onto the user's client session, which would then give you a tunnel into their browser, and then you would be able to take over the browser. And there are tools for that kind of stuff. That's not the purpose here. I'm not looking to scare the hell out of you guys on how to take over clients, but these type of tools do exist. And it all comes down to understand your stack, never trust user input, use least privilege, and make sure that you're trying as much as possible to use good practices so that these type of vulnerabilities aren't easily exploited. And this scenario, this was a very, very well-funded business that was authorized to spin this up, and it has access to a ton of customer data. And luckily we were able to catch it before it was public, but there's lots of web apps out there today that you can do this on that are live. Azure functions, simply running containers, guys. So it's just code. So at the end of the day, if you have the capability of processing and running it, now it'll be isolated. Microsoft's doing a really good job. Serverless compute doesn't mean it doesn't run without a server. It just runs with less servers. So the same type of vulnerabilities can exist there. But worse yet, modern application stacks are now more distributed and decoupled. So there are tons of more opportunities to breach in the cracks, i.e. in the messaging. So if you're using something like an Azure function that's triggered off of a queue or triggered off of an event grid, maybe those will be less likely protected. Or as an example, what I see a lot of, people spinning up their web applications as Linux or typically we're seeing this these days as Linux VMs in Azure, run their application stack while they modernize. So they're migrating and moving over. But the problem is that if you know about the Azure metadata service, in every single VM that you spin up, Windows or Linux, open up a browser on the server and go to 169.254, 169.254. There's a web server in your system that's designed to talk to Azure. And one of those services is the token auth service. And so if you have a managed identity that is been set up and running on your VM, it is possible to query in there and automatically get a token back that you can copy out of the VM, run outside of that VM, and directly connect up to other resources. And that's where you start getting into the ability to attack the management plane, because now you're able to take advantage of these cloud services to gain access to get other tokens that might have more privileges. As an example, maybe the managed identity has access directly to Key Vault. you can extract that information out, then connect to it outside of the VM in an untrusted environment to collect all the Key Vault data. Or maybe that gives you just enough token privileges to then be able to exchange it for a management token, use that management token to then give yourself more privileges in Azure AD, which then, or into the Azure Resource Manager, into these individual resources, which ultimately will pivot and give you access into Azure AD. So lots of different ways to do this kind of stuff. I hope that was helpful. I hope that was useful.